Could a dictator's son become the next president of the Philippines? Ferdinand Marcos Junior emerges as the frontrunner to replace Rodrigo Duterte. So, what does the election tell us about the state of Philippine politics today? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Campaigning has officially begun for the Philippine elections in May. 67 million voters are set to choose their representatives for Congress and local government, including governors and city mayors. But it's the race for president that's attracting the most attention. Candidates are vying to replace Rodrigo Duterte. The Philippines has held a presidential election every 6 years since 1986, when the revolution toppled the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. His son, Ferdinand Marcos Junior, has emerged as frontrunner. Other contenders include a vocal Duterte critic, a former movie star, and a champion boxer. Jamila Alindogan has more from Manila.
The 90-day election period has officially started in the Philippines. There are thousands of candidates vying for around 18,000 spots across the country. Elections in the Philippines are usually a festive affair. There is dancing, music, and lots of catchy phrases and colorful themes. But it doesn't make it any less vicious. The 2022 elections is seen as the most contentious in recent Philippine history.
There are candidates who can do many things and are kind, and let's say that they're corrupt. But now it's hard to find someone who is not corrupt. We have to consider their actions and how they're taking action now. Someone who is patriotic and who will put the country first.
I hope that the candidates will provide jobs and help the economy, not on and off, just like now, because sometimes people have something to eat and sometimes they don't. The rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer.
The next president is expected to inherit an unprecedented number of challenges in the country. The country is facing its worst economic recession in decades, staggering unemployment rate. Each candidate is promising reform, unity, and change. But this election is no different. Most of the candidates are using their family connections, money, and popularity to get elected.
So, who are the leading candidates? Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is leading the opinion polls despite being accused of whitewashing his family's past to try and build a new image for himself. His running mate for vice president is one of President Rodrigo Duterte's daughters, Sarah. The current vice president, Leni Robredo, is the only female presidential candidate. The former human rights lawyer is a harsh critic of Duterte's so-called war on drugs. The mayor of Manila and former movie star Francisco Domagoso is also in the race. Better known by his screen name, Isko Moreno, he's promised a strong stance against China's militarization of the South China Sea. Senator and boxing champion Manny Pacquiao has also questioned Duterte's relationship with China. He's vowing to jail corrupt officials if elected. All right, let's bring in our guests in Marikina. That's near the capital, Manila. Danilo Arao, professor of journalism at the University of the Philippines. He's also convener of the election watchdog Contra Dia, that means against fraud. In Paris, author and journalist Criselda Yabes. And in Manila, Richard Heydarian, professor of political science at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. He's the author of the book called The Rise of Duterte, a Populist Revolt Against Elite Democracy. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining the program today. Criselda, let me start with you. What does the state of this election say about the state of Philippines politics today?
Well, basically for us, it's just either we move forward or we go back. Moving forward means undoing what President Duterte has done and moving forward towards more democratic goals, although that's kind of vague, but basically bringing back, the rule of law, human rights, and well, if you can, equality. But moving back means going back means voting for Ferdinand Marcos Junior, the son of the late dictator. And people somehow seem to have this illusion that it was the golden age of the Philippines, and it was not. So going back basically would also mean unemployment, more corruption, money getting stolen from the coffers, and it would just be a repeat of what Bongbong Marcos's father has done. So that's essentially it for now. There are more things to be unearthed, of course, but that would depend on how it would move forward. And even if we do move forward, it would still take time. It's not as if things will change overnight. There's a lot to be to be corrected. There's a lot to straighten up, and so it just really depends on the kind of leadership that we will have this year.
Danilo, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Criselda was saying there. It looked like you wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
Of course, this is the make or break when it comes to whatever's left of our democracy. As Criselda correctly noted, there's a lot going on in the Philippines right now with all the problems due to the reign of impunity and tyranny. So the 2022 polls will basically be an indictment of the Duterte administration, although we do acknowledge the fact that as early as now, Bongbong Marcos has a commanding lead based on the recent surveys of voter preference with regard to those running for president. So there's a lot to talk about right now, and from a media standpoint, we can see here that the formula for disinformation is working very well for the Marcos camp, because right now, if ever he would end up as the winner of the presidential race, it's something, well, there are certain parallelisms to the Trump campaign in the sense that there is really a vast network of disinformation going on. And we do acknowledge the fact that for media organizations, there's Check.ph, there's FactFirst.ph, there are various groups right now that are doing fact-checking, and a lot of people are very concerned with what's happening, and they do fact-checking themselves. We see a high level of vigilance among the people right now.
Richard, Danilo there was talking about disinformation. I saw that you were also reacting to what he was saying, and I want to ask you, from your perspective, how much is disinformation playing a role in the election thus far, and how much do you think it will play a role in the election going forward, or at least the campaigning?
Well, I mean, let's not kid ourselves here. As far as Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. is concerned, he doesn't only have a commanding lead. It's increasingly looking like a prohibitive lead over all other rivals. He has more than twice the numbers of the second closest rival, the opposition leader, Leni Robredo. At its most fundamental level, I think what we're witnessing right now is what historians would call a counter-revolution. This is about the Marcos project of nostalgic politics and the evisceration of the greatest ideals, the promise and the institutional legacy of the 1986 EDSA revolution, which toppled the Marcoses. Should current trends stand and Imelda Marcos and the rest of the family find themselves back in the presidential palace, we are talking about nothing less than a regime change. So for me, this is the most important Philippine elections, at least in the past half a century, and the stakes are extremely high. And let's see whether the trend lines will hold in the coming weeks and months, because this was supposed to be a course correction for all the troubles and mistakes of the Duterte administration. Instead, this could be actually tipping the Philippines' besieged democracy over the cliff.
Criselda, Richard there was just talking about this nostalgia factor, and a few moments ago you were talking in your answer about the fact that potential voters are associating Mr. Marcos with this golden age, and I'm wondering how that came to be. I mean, you're talking about Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is the son of a dictator. His father was overthrown by a popular revolt. So how do we get to this stage right now where the lens that people are, or it seems many potential voters in the Philippines are looking through to view Mr. Marcos is a lens of nostalgia?
Well, just to simplify simplify things, it's basically a lack of critical thinking, but also because a lot of things went wrong with the education system since the 1986 People Power Revolt that restored democracy. So you don't, your textbooks, your school books didn't have anything or didn't have much about what really went on during the martial law era. And you compare that to Marcos having had the best intellectuals of his time write a book about his ideology, which the family still tried to carry over through the years. So you have that. So you have the education system going down, and you also have the population growing, and you have a majority of the population who don't have access to good education, who don't have access to books. Filipinos don't generally read books. I hate saying that because it's not entirely true, but in the sense that it's not the first thing that they would look for to find out about what really went wrong, to the country and what happened during martial law. So it's easy for them to just believe in whatever is told to them, whatever they see on Facebook, whatever they see on social media. And, if you have a big portion of the population not having access to good education, and if you have education not improving as much as it should be, then what do you have? People who become ignorant of what really went on, and people who don't know their history doesn't have much of a future. And that's where we are now. We don't know what our future will be. That's the problem. That's the biggest problem.
Danilo, I want to take a step back for a moment and talk about the importance, or perhaps we should say popularity, of political dynasties in the Philippines and examine that with you for a couple of minutes, because the running mate for Ferdinand Marcos Jr., his running mate, the choice for vice president, is Sara Duterte. That's one of the daughters of the current president, Rodrigo Duterte. So just how powerful are political dynasties in the Philippines? And I also want to ask you if political parties have tended to be secondary to personalities there.
Well, right now, practically all regions in the Philippines would have political dynasties there. So the irony in the Philippines is that the poorer the area, the stronger the political dynasties become. Actually, even the party-list system has been hijacked by the rich and powerful, most especially big business and, of course, the political dynasty. So the party-list system has become a backdoor and an additional seat at the House of Representatives for those with the same surnames. Sometimes there's even anecdotal evidence where husband and wife would run in two separate districts. That's just so they would get a stronger foothold on their particular area where they hold dominion. So political dynasty is very, very powerful. And with regard to political parties, you're correct in saying that it's mainly personality-based, and it's mainly defined by money politics. Whoever can finance a particular political party, you can expect that to be the one to lord over the particular political landscape. So that's why turncoatism is very normal in the Philippines, unlike in other countries where changing parties would be a big scandal. Here, it's quite normal. In fact, the running joke is you lock 3 people in one room, and after a few hours or so, you'll have 5 political parties out of 3 people. That's how bad our political party system is.
Richard, you mentioned in your previous answer that from your vantage point, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has a commanding lead, perhaps a lead that nobody might be able to basically overcome going forward. The current vice president, Leni Robredo, she's a former human rights lawyer. She's been a harsh critic of President Duterte's so-called war on drugs. She is the leader of the opposition. I want to ask you first, what are her chances? Is there any way that she could perhaps actually be a viable threat to Mr. Marcos? And also, how organized overall is the opposition in the Philippines?
Well, in many ways, the strength of conservative, right-wing oriented leaders, whether it's Duterte or Marcos's, it's also a function of the weakness of the opposition. I mean, the Philippine opposition is notoriously divided. You move to the left, there are at least three different factions there. As far as the center left or liberal Democrats like Leni Robredo are concerned, there was an effort to create a common united front, a united opposition. That didn't pan out. It was supposed to be something of a combination of Leni Robredo, Senator Manny Pacquiao, and Isko Moreno. Guess what? All of them are now running against each other. Now, if you look at the other side, actually, Bongbong Marcos was only number 3. He was only polling at 13% 6 months ago, 2 quarters ago. Now he is at 53% in some of the more authoritative surveys. And a large part of that is because Sara Duterte decided to side with him rather than to go against him. So as disunited as the opposition has been, the other side has been relatively more united. But let me also push back a little bit against, I agree with Criselda that critical thinking and basic education is important. But let's not forget the basic data. If you look at the solid base, the inelastic support base, both for Duterte and Marcos, it's actually in the most developed parts of the country. It's in National Capital Region. It's in northern provinces of the Philippines, which are more developed. And if you look at the demographic base, it's among ABC middle class, where Duterte and Marcos actually have the highest numbers of support. And that has a lot to do with a lot of disenchanted middle-class Filipinos who joined EDSA 1 revolution, who joined EDSA 2 revolution, and they didn't see the fundamental changes in the country. The proliferation of political dynasties dominating up to 90% of legislature has made a mockery out of the ideals of the 1986 revolution. So you have an angry, disenchanted section of the middle class, really as the solid base of the Marcos. And unfortunately, the rest of that is a lot of bandwagoning, a lot of fashion, and a lot of just people going with the latest fad as far as this election is concerned. So the middle class in the Philippines has turned against democracy, and we have seen this trend in Thailand, in Chile, in Turkey, in Brazil, many other countries which are also experiencing their own counter-revolution.
Criselda, I want to ask you if you think we are going to see President Duterte endorse a candidate from those currently running. Previously, he had chosen Senator Christopher Go, but Mr. Go, I believe, withdrew from the race last year. I believe it was in November. Is President Duterte going to endorse somebody, and do you believe that that will be Mr. Marcos?
He's been saying things against Bongbong Marcos, so I'm not really sure about him endorsing him, but knowing Duterte, you never know what he'll do at the last minute. Everything about Philippine politics is always at the last minute. I mean, yes, we see the surveys going up, but you'll never really know until like the last month or even the last 2 weeks. And that's what happened, 6 years ago. There's just so much unpredictability in what's going on now, and not just now, but even in the last few years. And it's all fed by a lot of confusion, a lot of trickery, a lot of disinformation, and how to get out of that is something difficult to do. So I really don't know what Duterte would do now. I think he might just wait and see as well at the last minute. And, knowing him, you just don't know. I mean, this whole thing has been like a political telenovela. And I think that's the sad part about the country. It's, we've come to a point where every day we don't know anymore what might happen to us. We haven't yet reached a point where whoever wins, these institutions will still keep working. We don't know anymore. We don't know what will happen to policies and institutions once somebody else takes power. And it depends on who that person is. It's really, as Danilo said earlier, it's really all about personalities. And that's going to be our pitfall, the biggest pitfall ever.
Danilo, it looks very much like you want to jump in, so please go ahead.
I agree with Criselda when she says that everything is so unpredictable. And in fact, I would even dare say that Duterte does not have an idea right now on what he will be doing, and that he is depending on whatever unfolds in the near future. He may be criticizing Bongbong Marcos now, but later on, he might be sharing the same stage with him. I understand that right now he has endorsed a few senatorial candidates, so it won't be surprising if he'll be endorsing another one. However, let me just jump into what happened in 1992, just to test how unpredictable things are. We were expecting a presidential candidate named Ramon Mitra to be a shoe-in for the presidency, but a day before or a few days before election day, something controversial hounded him, And then President Fidel Ramos became the eventual winner. So you see that kind of unpredictability dating back to 1992. And if we want to go further back, actually the disinformation network by the Marcoses actually started not now or not recently, but in 1989, when they started coming back to the Philippines after their exile in the United States. They tried to run for local office somewhere in the northern part of the country. They succeeded. They tested the waters again to run for national office, particularly the Senate. It worked again. You had Amy Marcos and Bongbong Marcos becoming senator. And right now, we're seeing Bongbong Marcos reaping the quote-unquote rewards of their patience for what happened, for the seeds that they planted dating back to 1989.
Richard, what will President Duterte's legacy be? How popular does he remain? That's first and foremost. How popular does he remain in the Philippines? And how difficult will it be for whomever is elected next to step out of that shadow?
Well, I mean, Duterte is the embodiment of what you can call performative populism, right? His numbers are really, really high. I mean, he's at plus 60 net approval rating. This is unprecedented. We're looking at numbers that no other Filipino president achieved. And yet it seems there's an inverse relationship with Duterte's popularity numbers and actual effectiveness of this president in dealing with some fundamental issues facing the country, including the pandemic, including the economic damage and recovery from that economic damage. The Philippines is among the poorest performing countries in the region. And at some point, it was at the bottom of the rankings in Southeast Asia and the broader Asian region. So it seems that the two are disconnected. And a lot of that is about the performativity of this administration. Everyone talks about disinformation under the Marcoses, but the Dutertes are, President Duterte's supporters are experts in this. And a lot of them now are switching to the Marcos side. So we're going to see perhaps more continuation of the president. Now, what's his legacy going to be? Well, history will tell, right? As someone put in the past. We can make all sorts of arguments about where he failed and where he not. Obviously, if you're a critic of Duterte or you care about human rights, you're going to be horrified by the number of extrajudicial killings and his drug war. But if you're a supporter of Duterte, you're going to look at how he dealt with some low-hanging problems. For instance, passports in the Philippines are easier to get. A lot of basic of office work is now easier. A lot of infrastructure projects started under Duterte. So it depends. It depends on what you care about more. And clearly, we are in an unprecedented territory because in the past, the National Capital Region, Manila, tends to be anti-incumbency, meaning they tend to go against the opposition. And yet, if you look at the number of Leni Robredo, I'm going back to your actually previous question because I didn't answer it directly. Leni Robredo is doing really bad in National Capital Region. The National Capital Region is voting more for Bongbong Marcos by far. So this looks like a vote against the EDSA regime that replaced Marcos. And this is a vote that is favoring the whole Duterte-Marcos axis.
Criselda, you talked before about the unpredictability factor. And I want to ask you about something that's obviously going to have an impact in this campaign, and that would be COVID-19. How much concern is there right now in the Philippines about it? And from your vantage point, how might it impact, the campaign and perhaps the election?
Yeah, you're talking about the pandemic, the virus?
Yes.
Yes. When I think people who went through the first difficult year of the pandemic realized that they were on their own, that government wasn't going to be there to help them. Clearly, that should have been like a negative factor for the government, but it wasn't. And why that was so, I'm not sure. But I think essentially people just got the hang of doing things on their own because national government has never been there. And you can say that when it comes to natural disasters, which happens every year. And, there has been no clear policy on what should be done about climate change, renewable energy, and stuff like that. People have become numb to demanding accountability. If you go to even the smallest province, smallest villages, and you see a government official who has a beautiful house compared to others, people don't ask, why do you have that? Where did you get the money from. To them, in their minds, maybe we should also try to do that, join government so we can also have enough money. So the values have somehow been distorted, and that has changed. So with COVID-19, I'm not even sure it made a big dent.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Danilo Arao, Criselda Yabes, and Richard Heydarian. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.